Hi, good evening, and welcome to our Food, Religion and Writing panel debate. Many thanks for your interest and registration. My name is Kümin, and I'm very grateful to our panelists for agreeing to take part tonight, to all of you for tuning in, as well as to Ricardo and Susan Gibson for helping to put today's event in place. I'm an early modernist at the Department of History here at Warwick and the academic lead of food cultures, one of the themes of the university's global research priority on food, which is supporting today's proceedings. The Food Global Research Priority is one of Warwick's 10 interdisciplinary GRPs. This university-wide program supports cross-departmental collaboration, enabling Warwick researchers to work together across faculties and with the wider community on issues of major importance today. Our food GRP has 4 themes: food and environment, food security, food and health, and food cultures. We base much of our activity around these themes, but are also open to other ideas and opportunities around food. Our next activities will be a webinar on enhancing food system resilience, featuring Dr. John Ingram from Oxford on the 24th of June, and a big outreach event entitled Food on the Move, which involves catering industry representatives and a public survey on changing food habits during the pandemic on the 9th of July at 5 p.m. Just search for Warwick Food GRP and register through our website if you're interested in taking part. Now, a few practicalities before we get started. This meeting is being recorded, and we would like to ask our audience to keep their videos off and microphones muted unless you're invited to speak, except for the panelists, of course. Proceedings start with individual opening statements, followed by a chance for the panelists to respond to each other, and then we'll have a general opportunity for questions and answers. Just raise queries by raising your hand at any point. Moving to the thematic context, we are investigating the multiple connections between faith, eating, and writing. Which foods and beverages mark particular religious occasions and why? When and where do consumption and spirituality come into conflict? These and other questions will be explored shortly. Now I want to introduce you to Ricardo Aguilar-González, who will give us some contextualizing remarks and an introduction to our speakers. He's a PhD student here at the Department of History, where he is studying foods, drinks, and societies in the transition from pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica to 16th century New Spain. He's also an academic staff on leave at Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás de Hidalgo in Morelina, Mexico. Ricardo, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Just a quick remark on the aim of this event. As Beat already mentioned, this is funded by the Global Research Priorities on Food at the University of Warwick. And the general aim of the event is to provide a space for the free exchange of opinions from people who have been directly or indirectly involved with food, who have professional interests, but also ethical or personal interests, and have engaged with food and drink cultures. So as we want to provide a space for sharing, and because food studies in general has become such a highly specialized area of knowledge, generation of knowledge, we privilege this interchange by having a brief introduction by our speakers today, and then we would like them to share and comment on each other's interests based on these 3 themes: writing, religion, and food. So without any further comment, I'd like to present today's panelists. I'm going to start with with Reverend Dr. Mark Bratton, who is an Anglican parish priest currently serving as rector of St. John Baptist Berkswell near Coventry. He initially studied history at UCL in the early 80s. He practiced as a barrister in London for a short while before studying theology at Oxford University for ordination. He has an MA, KCL, and PhD at Warwick in medical ethics and law. At Berkswell, he devised the Spirit of Berkswell project to tell the story of its ancient parish church in its community setting, collaborating with the Center for Christianity and Culture at the University of York and the Parish Studies Network at the University of Warwick. In 2013, he worked in partnership with the network to organize its first on-site national conference entitled From Berkswell and Beyond. In the same year, he held the first of many successful Berkswell beer festivals within the church and its annex, drawing 150 to roughly 200 members of the local community on each occasion. In 2021, as part of Warwick's global research priority dedicated to food and the Coventry City of Culture framework, he is collaborating to produce a food feast fair in Berkswell Church over the weekend of 20 to 12 December. Our next panelist is Dr. Giulia Champion. She is an early career teaching and research fellow at the University of Warwick, where she is currently working on transdisciplinary climate change communication, material histories, and blue humanities. She has recently edited a collection entitled Interdisciplinary Essays on Cannibalism, Bites Here and There, with Routledge, published in 2021. She is currently co-editing two journal special issues, one on intersection of activism and academia in Latin America with the Bulletin of Latin American Research, and other one on animal futurity with Green Letters. I'm presenting now Dr. Liz Dowler. She has now retired as a professor of food and social policy in Warwick Sociology, where she drew on science and social science to address food poverty and security, food rights and justice, local food initiatives, policy evaluation and reconnection to sustainable food systems. She is a member of the Food Ethics Council, working for a fairer food system, and a trustee of the People's Health Trust, which gives health lottery monies to local people who are tackling inequalities in health. She is also a member of the Iona community, a dispersed ecumenical Christian community working for peace and social justice, rebuilding of community, and the renewal of worship. Liz has worked with charities, government committees, and in European food policy evaluations, and originally in international nutrition based at LSHTM. Then I'm presenting also Dr. Christopher Kissane, who is a historian, writer, and reviewer. He was a researcher in economic history at LSE, and he worked with the Royal Historical Society, where he co-authored landmark reports on race and gender in UK history. He holds a PhD in economics and social history from Balliol College, Oxford, and previously he studied history at Trinity College, Dublin. Currently, he's editorial fellow at a history workshop and associate research fellow at Birkbeck, University of London, UK. He is also a BBC AHRC, New Generation Thinker. So welcome all, and in that same order, we'll start with some 5 to 8 minutes from with Dr. Mark Bratton's remarks. So please, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to share one picture. It's not quite the picture that I wanted to show you, but it'll give you a good idea of the, sorry, just let me go to my desktop. Good, let's see if this comes up. Can you see this?
Yes.
Right. I'm sorry about the wording on it. I couldn't find the picture.
Sorry, we can see a window.
You can see a picture of the church?
No, not the picture.
Ah, right. Okay. Then
you need to choose the picture, and you have chosen the a window instead.
All right. Okay. Let's. I don't need it. It was just for interest, but I haven't mastered the technology sufficiently to get the picture up. But I'll present anyway. Well, good evening, everyone. As Ricardo said, I'm Mark Bratton. I'm a priest in the Church of England, serving the parish of St. John Baptist, Berkswell, which is a beautiful little village in the rural corridor. It's kind of a bucolic idyll between Solihull on the one side and Coventry on the other. You may know it for its pub, the Bear Inn. Soon after I was licensed as parish priest, which was about 12 years ago, I devised a Spirit of Berkswell project, which was designed to tell the story of its ancient parish church in its community setting, as a way of encouraging the local community to reconnect with its heritage, as church buildings have things that people treasure: history, beauty, continuity. To that end, I worked in partnership with the Centre for Christianity and Culture at the University of York and the Parish Studies Network at the History Department of Warwick University. And in 2013, as Ricardo said, the network came to Berkswell for its national conference, which was a very successful day, bringing together top-class historians with members of the local community. Just want to say a little bit about Berkswell. Berkswell properly enters the historical record in Domesday, the Domesday Book, and it's been suggested that the name of the village is the contraction of the personal name Berkul and the village well, hence Berkswell. It's conjectured that Berkul was a Saxon landowner who was converted to the Christian faith through the preaching of missionary monks from Lichfield sometime in the 8th century and baptized in the village well. The existing church dates from the 12th century, but was very likely built on the site of an earlier Anglo-Saxon structure. Indeed, the octagonal crypt may have housed a relic of St. Mildred, a Benedictine abbess with connections to Mercian royalty, in the hope of making the church a place of pilgrimage and generating an income. They even had problems with generating the parish share in the 9th century, something which I wish wasn't close to my heart, but by necessity is. St. John Baptist Berkswell is one of the outstandingly beautiful and interesting churches in the West Midlands. For over 1,000 years, villagers have come to worship at the church. The stories of many aspects of village life are intimately connected with the church. The school began in the first floor room of the 16th century porch. The inn would have benefited from visitors to the shrine and the crypt. Generations of local families are buried in the churchyard. And drawing out these connections and other connections could help to reconnect the church more closely with everyday village life and reinvigorate relationships in new and exciting ways. As the oldest standing building, the church stands physically and metaphorically at the historic heart of Berkswell, holding the collective memory of the community in its fabric, its records, and its monuments. Setting the story of faith represented by the building and the congregation through the centuries in this broader context would provide creative ways of telling the whole story of Berkswell in partnership with the wider community. While the church continues to be a place of worship and a site of historical interest, if not pilgrimage, over the years, it seems to me that an invisible boundary line seems to have been drawn between the lives of the church, parts of the village community, and the secular pilgrims who bypass the church on their walking route along the Millennium Way, which includes the church drive. Although many of the local community are congregants, members of my congregation, those who are not often say that they don't feel any sense of connection with the building. Moreover, while many visitors enter the church to appreciate its architecture and to be still in its contemplative atmosphere, many others who consider, but do not perhaps out of a lack of sense of permission, choose to enter the church. And this reaction seems to be consistent with the empirical work of sociologists of religion like David Hay, who've charted the decline of religion and the corresponding rise of spirituality. So, as a way of addressing the widespread reluctance to enter Christian sacred space, I wanted to reprise the church's older function as a public space where people used to meet in the nave, to transact business, to socialize, and to meet generally. In 2013, the church held the first of what were to be many twice yearly beer festivals held within the nave and the church annex. As Ricardo said, drawing together about 150 to 200 members of the local community on each occasion to enjoy good beer, good food, good company, and a good live band in the church's numerous surroundings. In fact, just to conclude, the idea, the spark of the idea to begin these beer festivals started in the context of the marriage of Prince William and Kate in 2011. We were going to have a big village party down Church Drive, and the heavens opened. So we had to make a snap decision what we were going to do. Were we going to cancel the event, or was there some contingency plan or something, some alternative that we could employ immediately? And so we decided to repair into the church. All 300 of us. The tables were set up, and down the nave, in the crypt, in the annex, the West Indian steel band was put up into the South Gallery. And we had a fabulous time. But there was one individual in particular, a guy called Stan, who had lived in the village for 30 to 40 years and whose funeral I conducted, who, was not a churchgoer, but there he was with his Union Jack bowler hat, holding a pint of beer in his hand, clearly enjoying the occasion, saying to me, "I've lived in this village for 40 years, but not once have I crossed the threshold of this church. And here I am in these convivial, albeit religious surroundings, and having the time of my life." So that was the seed for the beer festivals. And I think that it's proved to be a wonderful way of, crossing what seems to be rather too rigid a boundary between the sacred space of this local church and the community at large.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now I'll pass the mic to Giulia.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Ah, lovely. Thank you so much, Beat and Ricardo, for organizing this event, Ricardo for inviting me, and Mark for this very insightful intervention. That was really interesting. I'm going to start now. So my research interest in the intersection of the themes we are discussing today straddles history and literary studies a bit, and began actually a long time ago now during my master between Queen Mary University in London and Warwick, which was based on global Shakespeare. And as I started those studies at the time, I was fascinated by how across all of the plays we were looking at in Shakespeare, commensality played a crucial role. And you can sort of understand characters, their relations on the basis as to whether they it together. Alliances are done or undone. Peace is agreed upon and war declared just around the dinner table. An absence from this space is crucial too, as it reinforces the marginalization of certain characters. In comedies, the happy denouement and forged bonds are often celebrated by a final banquet, and it is telling when someone is not invited. So I think here, for example, of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. And as I kept looking, I noticed that also what and how people were eating played a crucial role. It forged identities, but also allows a space to indicate people's behavior and misbehavior. And in this particular context, metaphorical and literal cannibalism began to play quite a crucial role, and it's quite pervasive across many plays. So associating characters to flesh-eating habits or ogre-like features is supposedly extremely telling on them, and it moves across many plays. It's not just associated with characters such as Othello, Caliban, and Shylock, but plays a crucial role in many Romance plays, is also a way to describe Falstaff across a number of plays, etc. And as I was doing more research in what was at the time an early modern context, obviously came across how the accusation and description of cannibalism obviously abounded for when it came to some sort of, I'm using quotation mark here in case people don't see me, but savage tribes, obviously not something I want to use, but in the time of the early modern context, obviously played a role by a number of authors. You might all know about people such as Jean de Léry, Montaigne, Columbus, Handstad, and etc. But it also appeared in crucial tensions and bloodshed between cannibals and Catholics, sorry, not a slip, and Protestants, who aptly accused each other of anthropophagy to the practice of the Eucharist and corpse medicine. And so as time passes, my PhD research moved to a colonial context, and I started engaging with a number of authors from Latin America and the Caribbean, which have been using the trope to describe cultural identity and their writing practice. So therefore, sort of, and it directly engage with the research I've done before with Shakespeare, because the starting point is Osvaldo Andrade's 1924 Anthropophagist Manifesto, in which one of the aphorisms is in English and exclaims, "To pee or not to pee, that is the question." And playing on Hamlet's famous line and allying Brazilian identity to what was the supposed cannibalism of Tupinamba people described by the names I mentioned above or just now. And so a number of issues sort of came out in this work, which, I wouldn't have time here to go into detail. But the use of anthropophagy and cannibalism sort of is quite crucial and started being quite, as I did research, was very present across the American continent in intellectual and cultural work. In particular, a number of authors from the 1920s to today, across Brazil and Mexico, but also in the Caribbean, in Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Jamaica. And it was very much articulated across the idea of writing and cultural practice. And the type of research I've been doing sort of engages with how this works, how it comes from specific practices that have been associated with indigenous community, but have been also misread to many degrees. A lot of Brazilian authors have engaged with the way and sort of derides a bit Anne Sadden when he's saying, oh, you know, I survived. And really, well, you've survived because the indigenous groups would only eat brave and honorable people. So there's like a lot of tensions that are interesting there. But what I think cannibalism allows to create across these three themes is this idea of corporeality and commensality, and thinking about what is allowed to be eaten, what is good behavior, bad behavior, what is not allowed. And as I did more research and looked at all these authors and now they articulated it, it came to be clear that sort of my PhD research, which is now being peer reviewed for monograph proposal, if everything goes well, I sort of engaging with these authors, moved around this metaphor and really proposed the idea that it is actually a more apt way to describe colonial practices and extractive practices, especially in the context of plantation agriculture. So here is kind of my food writing and religion journey. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and comments, and the other panelists as well.
Thank you very much, Giulia. So we've started making, well, I think we all panelists have started making these connections between Mark and the reappropriation of public space, and Giulia and the European societies on cannibalism. Now we'll go with Liz Dowler, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I've really enjoyed the commentaries so far. Gosh, there's such a lot to engage with there. So I'll try and be brief, and then there'll be time for people to do that. So you know who I am. I was in sociology in Warwick, working on food and social policy. And I was at Warwick for about 15 years, London School of Hygiene for 20 odd years before that. I may say that for most of my working life, and I've said that well, firstly, when I said I work on food and poverty, nobody's terribly interested. And when I said I was at London School of Hygiene, most people said, oh, I think I went there when I came back from Kathmandu feeling ill. And I'd say, no, that's the Hospital for Tropical Diseases. Nobody'd ever heard of London School of Hygiene, and now everybody's heard of it because of the pandemic. Anyway, sorry, I digress, not being brief as I promised. So as I've already said, most of my working life, I've focused on food and poverty, food, nutrition and poverty. I was in the nutrition department at London School. And I was initially working in the global south in many different parts of the world, looking at malnutrition and how that is a marker for societies which are being fractured, usually by forces externally. So it wasn't so much that I was trying to deal with the problems on the ground. I certainly was never part of a movement of teaching people how to eat or mothers to look after their children better or anything like that. I was very much part of using stories and evidence, quantitative evidence, from survey material to try and understand why people were in the conditions that they were and what leverage there was, what room for manoeuvre in development policies or whatever it happened to be. And then about 20 years ago, I started working in Britain and in Europe, trying to do the same thing, actually. And you heard all that in the introduction, so I don't need to go into the details of it. But my interest has always been, actually, in fairness and in decency and in equity and the possibilities of joyous food. I'm somebody who loves to cook and eat, and I love offering hospitality to people. I've got guests arriving more or less as we finish. I've just been baking a cake. That's why I disappeared. Sorry, it wasn't I was bored, or I had to go and check that the cake had come out of the oven okay. So I'm not a very good baker, actually. That's what I've learned in the pandemic. But I believe very passionately, and I think I'm not alone in this, many people share this, that everybody should be able to eat decently. People should not have to beg. People should not have to go to charity. People should not have to obtain food in ways which do not respect their dignity, who they are. And also they should be able to eat well. They should be able to eat healthily, that which is good for their body, of course, London schools, all about that, but also for their mind and their soul. This is the fundamental, that food is part of, food brings together all of that which makes for wellness and thriving individuals, thriving households, and thriving communities, both how it's grown, how it's processed, how it's sold, retailed, etc. And as everybody said, not time to go into all of that, but I'm sure these ideas are familiar to many here. But what I think, for me, what I gradually learned from the people with whom I did research, not from textbooks, but from experience, was how fundamental food is to hospitality, welcome, and sharing. That it's part of the identity, not just of the individual, but of the group. We are people who eat like this. And you, a stranger, or a friend, or a relative from elsewhere, you too can come and join us and eat as we do. And that's not just the nutrients, it's not just even the dishes, it's how we eat. Do we sit on the floor? Do we stand? Do we walk about? All of those things. And I don't need to spell it out really, but all of these things are so fundamental to who we are and how we feel about ourselves. And as you know, for a long time now, I've been a member of the Food Ethics Council, which you may or may not have heard of. I encourage you to look it up in a well-known search engine, and you'll find it quickly. It's a small charity that really tries to put ethics at the heart of the food system. It's a UK-based charity, but obviously in the UK, as in many European countries, we eat the world. So of course it deals with issues from many parts of the world. And there's quite a lot of interest in linking up actually with people elsewhere, maybe to have a network of food ethics councils. We certainly aren't big enough to go anywhere else. And it's most of the people who are members, well, all the people who are members of the council are unpaid, but there's a small staff team who do quite a lot of innovative and really creative, challenging work over the years. One of the current projects with which I'm not directly involved, but I certainly backed it and supported it as it kicked off and continue to do so, is to link in with the citizenship movement in Britain. Citizenship is a word that is loaded in all kinds of ways, but for the moment, it's citizenship, food citizens set against food consumers. Language, as all of you will know, is absolutely crucial. If you label somebody a consumer, you define their relationship to the market, usually in monetary terms, possibly exchange of goods and services. But you also individualize them and atomize them, and you enable them to be the focus for interest and manipulation from many actors externally. If you describe somebody, more to the point, if you begin to think of yourself as a food citizen, it changes the way you think about your relationship to food, where it comes from, who controls it, and how it fits in the world. So the Food Ethics Council is doing quite a big project on food citizenship at the moment. Maybe opportunity to say more about that in a minute if it comes up. But we don't just look at what people eat and how they eat it and who gets paid what to do what, where power lies in the food system, all of these crucial things. We also try to look at the whole natural, social, political environment. So we're also looking at animals quite a lot. We've got 2 projects at the moment about meat and dairy, trying to enable some dialogue, some reconciliation almost, although we don't use that word very often, but about the possibilities of people who have hitherto been on very opposing sides, being able to be in the same room in the past, quite literally, sitting around a table, offered over food, talking about where their common ground is. And just as a sort of flag up, people will know very well that one of the big lines at the moment in climate change, climate chaos, work against climate chaos is that we should all give up eating meat or stop using animals and so on. And that becomes a very polarized debate very quickly. And in the Food Ethics Council, as in other places, we're trying to find the way through that, both in language and in realities, which are not so oppositional and not so, threatening to people who have, to actors in the food system who have many interests, like small farmers, like small dairy farmers, or people who are vegan who don't want to be polarized at one end of a polarity. So certainly care for animals, we link a lot with compassion in world farming, and quite a lot of our work is about standards and labels and trust, how you can trust purchases. So that's a little bit about the Food Ethics Council. And the second thing, as mentioned right at the beginning, is that I'm also a member of the Iona community, which is an ecumenical, dispersed Christian community, women and men, I'd like to say all over the world. There's not huge numbers in the Asian continent, there are a few, and not as many as we would like in Africa or Southern America, but there are quite a lot in many other parts of the world, members and associates. And it's, as was said, we work for peace, justice, and the integrity of creation in a sustainable world. All sorts of things there you can find again on the website. You can trace all that through. And the renewing of community and worship and challenges in worship, changing liturgies and so on. And even there, what's become very apparent in the last decade or so is how central food is to what we do. The Iona community is so named after a tiny little island off the west coast of Mull, which is a slightly bigger island off the west coast of Britain. And as an American colleague in sociology said to me, Britain is a slightly bigger island off the west coast of Europe. So anyway, these things all depend on where you're standing, of course. 1500 years ago, St. Columba from Ireland, lot of stories about Columba, but the key one is that in escaping from Ireland because he was trying to avoid facing some justice calls, ended up on this little island, which at the time was not a tiny place on the periphery, but central, because all of these islands were, because they were on the seaways, centre of land masses were dangerous places 1500 years ago. People went by small boats, and that was the network, the centre of the world. And that became a kind of cradle of what was often referred to as Western or Celtic Christianity. The Book of Kells was started in Iona and then moved about a bit because of violence and so on. Anyway, to revert to the present Ireland, people go there in their droves, in normalement, as you might say. The island, which has a rebuilt Benedictine Abbey and Abbey Church, would expect upward of 800 to 1,000 people a day in the summer. They've had nobody for the last year, and it's been quite a challenge in all kinds of ways. They're starting to open up now, and that in itself feels very threatening, as well as also something they're longing for. But all of those people who come are given a welcome, and very often food and drink, of course, it's a central feature. So not just in Iona, everywhere. Food, as I've already said, is how you welcome people. And it is, as I've said, part of identity and so on. So let me conclude then with a couple of really key questions, it seems to me. If food is central to identity and belonging and very profoundly links faith and worship in Christian communities, of course, a meal is the center of worship, arguably. How is it, as a Christian society, we have allowed the scandal to continue of millions of people, not just all over the world, but actually within our own society? And I'm sorry, I'm speaking in a very Eurocentric way here. I know there are people in the audience from all over, but I also know the same problems apply where you are. Not to experience this. People are not only hungry, but they are actively excluded from the means of providing for themselves. And if they are lucky, and again, I'm putting inverted commas around, they are allowed to have charitable food over which they have no choice and for which they have to be grateful. And of course, many are. And many of the people who are hungry or struggling to eat are migrants or refugees or people who have who can't eat the foods that they're offered. One of the most challenging things for the people in the I've just described is to be given a parcel of food where you can't eat any of it, either because of your health conditions or because it's absolutely not in your culture to eat whatever it is you've just been given. So how is it we continue to allow that to happen? And churches and other faith groups are very centrally involved in feeding people, of course. And some of you will know I've quite often challenged that we go on doing that rather than asking, challenging, shouting, this should not be happening. You might be interested to know there's an all-party parliamentary group meeting, I think today, to talk about how can we stop having food banks. It's a very live issue here at the moment. So, and then my second question, I suppose, which is a more general one, is how can we all continue to build a resilient food system which enables everyone to eat healthily, well, while supporting fair and decent livelihoods and protecting nature and society to enable it to function in the face of shocks. What we've learned in the last year, and the Food Ethics Council has written a lot about this, many others too, of course, is we need connection, care, and community. So how can we work with faith groups and others to enable that to happen? And in my final sentence, I want to plug a book, which I'm pretty certain is out of print. I haven't got it as a slide. It's a rather wonderful book by Kathy Campbell, a Canadian who wrote many years ago about food insecurity in her society. And it's called The Stations of the Banquet. And it's a scripture-based exploration of the Christian story of salvation as a food story. So what that highlights, of course, is that in the Christian narrative, a banquet is in the New Testament where we're heading. And indeed, abundance and fecundity is the language of the whole of the Hebrew Bible, applies in Jewish and also in Islamic traditions, and no doubt in many others. So God, whatever image, whatever notion, whatever knowledge you have of God, God is not a parsimonious, a paring down being. He does not want the best for creation. God is a God of abundance. That's absolutely the imagery in so many scriptures, not just Christian ones. So how have we so lost sight of that? Okay, my 5 minutes is as elastic as an Anglican priest's. I'll stop.
Thank you a lot, Liz. Now we'll head to Chris.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to those who I was speaking with earlier this afternoon about my book, Food, Religion and Communities in Early Modern Europe. I am a historian of the early modern period, and especially of the early modern version of a question that Liz mentioned, or a statement that Liz mentioned, which is sort of, we are people who eat like this, and other people are people who eat like something else. And my research asks how early modern people asked those questions or made those statements about themselves, about other groups, how they defined themselves through what they ate, and how they defined other people through what they ate, and how those dividing lines or ways of unifying communities created interesting tensions that tell us about how they thought about themselves in the world, and the way that food can tell us about that. Obviously, I study a period that is now more than half a millennium ago, but one of the great things about working in food is the way that a lot of the questions that we all work on, whether it's academically or through activism, echo through time, because a lot of the ethical questions, a lot of the social questions that we all work on have reappeared in different guises through different societies throughout different centuries. And as I was preparing for this event and thinking about the amazing different work that Mark and Giulia and Liz do, I was thinking about different
public engagement events that I have done back when I was living in the UK. I now live in Lisbon, but back when I worked in the UK, about my own research and about ways that I tried to communicate research about a period that often seems very far away and very foreign to school children or members of the public who are not normally interested in history. And of course, food is a very useful way of doing that because everybody is interested in food. But at the same time, Britain in the 21st century is a much different religious place to the religious world that I studied 500 years ago, where food was a very daily part of people's worship, as was mentioned earlier, but also people's sense of religious identity every day, which is not necessarily an experience that a lot of less religious people have in Western society today. But it was really interesting for me always to encounter people from the Jewish community and the Muslim community in Britain, and how a lot of the dynamics that I spoke about for early modern Christians in terms of the policing of different seasons of feasting and fasting, of the adherence to specific rules, of maybe the difficulty of being an individual member of a religious community, having to keep certain dietary rules while surrounded by people of different religions who don't keep those rules. The isolation of keeping up that kind of experience was something that I found really interesting in the way that it echoes across time. You know, I was very struck once by doing an event with Muslim students at a university in the UK who were talking about the isolating experience of having moved from a predominantly Muslim community where they grew up in London in a Muslim majority school, where, for example, during Ramadan, most of their peers will also be fasting, to going to a university where they were, you know, one of very few Muslim students. And what a different experience that was, that Ramadan went from being a kind of communal, collective activity to something that was very personal and individual, and went from kind of the normal rhythm, or as they perceived it, the normal rhythm of life, to something that was much more different, that isolated them from the rest of their community. And I thought about that a lot actually over the last year, because, you know, normally, you know, we would be holding an event like this in a room, you know, maybe at one of Mark's beer festivals actually would be a great place to hold an event like this, on Friday evening especially. But of course, we're doing this over a screen. And a lot of, well, almost all of the last 12 months, people have had to engage in their religious and cultural celebrations or religious and cultural events remotely. And I think that that has really highlighted for people the importance of food as both an individual or family and a collective part of our religious identities, if we are religious in a kind of practicing sense, but also our religious heritage for people for whom things like Christmas and Easter have become social, cultural festivals rather than active religious celebrations. They were endowed with a much different importance for people, I think, this year, when, you know, the days, I don't know if this was the same experience that lots of other people had, but like dinner every day became a really big event in our house, because every day was basically the same. You know, you weren't going out very much. You couldn't go and see your friends. You couldn't go out and do things. You were just working at home and then being at home in the evening. And so what you had for dinner, or something that could delineate certain periods of the year or certain events from the rest of the year, suddenly became very important. You know, it's Easter, we're going to make a big Easter dinner, or it's Christmas, or what are you going to give? You know, it's the first time since being a child in Catholic school in Ireland that I considered giving something up for Lent. You know, in the end, I thought we're probably dealing with enough not to do it, but it did cross my mind. And even, you know, a lot of people I knew actually were taking a lot more of an interest in their neighbors or friends' religious celebrations. You know, a lot more interest in the fact that when you were on a Zoom call with your Muslim friends, they were doing Ramadan at home, or maybe when they were celebrating Eid, or most recently, obviously, for me, the experience of seeing Jewish friends have to celebrate Passover, which is very much a kind of a collective food celebration through a Zoom screen. And especially Passover, because, you know, Passover begins with, you know, that thing that Liz said about, you know, we are people who eat like this. Passover meals begin with the Manishtana, where every year Jewish families ask and respond to a set of ritual questions which explain why they're about to have the specific meal that they have to celebrate Passover. They say, you know, why do we eat in this manner on this night? Why do we eat on, you know, these things today, whereas normally we don't eat that? It's kind of a restatement of faith. every year through the food that they eat. And for people to have to do that remotely was a very, I think, alienating experience for a lot of people that evoked what I was saying about, the Muslim students going off to university and suddenly having to find ways to motivate themselves and keep the discipline of Ramadan, without being at the heart of the community. I think that even for people who are not religious, those kind of cultural rituals, that kind of cultural heritage that we receive from our community was thrown into a very different light this year by the pandemic, because of the fact that, what you were going to put on the table in the evening was probably the most exciting part of the day. But also in the context, as Liz mentioned, of a lot greater emphasis or awareness of hunger and food poverty in the last year, not only because of public campaigns. In the UK, obviously, you had a big campaign about school dinners and stuff. We had sort of from abroad what looked very bizarre thing of kind of the government seeming to be against feeding hungry children, which is an interesting political triangulation. But not just that, but also like here in Portugal and many other countries all around the world, the visibility of people and neighbours having to go to food banks here in Lisbon, the parish council having to provide food, especially for elderly people and people who are out of work and stuff, and how that very much, with all the restaurants closed and all the kind of normal ways that we think about eating as a kind of, a leisure activity has almost become in wealthy countries more than anything else, a much greater awareness of, actually, there's something very wrong here. If that, even while we are all effectively being told, and in some cases paid to stay at home, there's still these great inequalities taking place. And that made me think a lot about, my research about the way that people in the early modern period thought about the ethics surrounding food in their writing, because one of the things that we're talking about this evening is writing, and food was a very important religious metaphor to early modern writers. Giulia mentioned, the way that writing is a way for early modern thinkers to kind of clarify what would become starker social divisions, especially in her context in the case of colonialism, but even in religious divisions or religious change in Europe, the language of food in scripture and in religious writing was a way of talking about the way that people could access a new way of being through spiritual nourishment as opposed to physical nourishment, and that the combination of those things of being nourished by the physical world, that kind of abundant God that Liz was talking about, but also the kind of spiritual nourishment that comes from the kind of the word of God as kind of a way of feeding yourself spiritually. And of course, throughout the pandemic and seeing all the terrible things that we've all had to witness and think about, a lot of people have been searching for a greater sense of meaning, and there's been a lot more self-reflection, I think, because we've all had time to do that, but also because you are faced with these very difficult questions. And one of the people that I work on a lot of my research is the Swiss Reformation leader Huldrych Zwingli, who I work on because of his use of food language and also food as a way of delineating sort of early Protestantism from capitalism. But I also read a really interesting poem that Zwingli wrote early in his life when he was suffering from the plague and the outbreak of the plague, which was kind of ubiquitous in pre-modern Europe. And I remember reading it at the very beginning of the pandemic when a very good friend of mine's father had passed away from the coronavirus, and the kind of universality of the experience was quite arresting, in the sense that it was like, wow, amazing people going through very similar, the sense of hopelessness, not understanding, but also, they dealt with plague in ways that were obviously quite different, but also not dissimilar to the way that we have, in the sense that you didn't go outside, you isolated yourself, you quarantined, nobody entirely understood how it was being passed around at the beginning and so on. But also the way that Zwingli talked about kind of nourishing himself back to health physically and spiritually, and basically he uses this as a metaphor for his own kind of spiritual awakening. But it's also the kind of, you come back to health through eating and being stronger and so on. And that just made me think about how lucky we are to work on a subject that can resonate throughout time across so many different elements of the way that we think about ourselves and so on. So yeah, it was just very inspiring to hear that the other three panelists and to think about these things after a year in which I guess all of these things have been thrown into a very different light in terms of how we think about the relationship between food and our sense of meaning, but also food and our relationships to other people and our identity. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I would like now to open, well, we have all these all these themes to reflect on, and I would like to encourage all the members of the panel to, engage with each other on each other's remarks on the importance of food, religion, and writing. And I was while I was preparing for the reading session today, I found really relevant this text that Chris uses from Robert Applebaum on how there's it meant to be written for early modern period, but I think that from what we've heard from you, it's also relevant from now, and it talks about this how people experience food with great intensity, awareness of the social, philosophical, and religious implications. So I think that we've seen just that, and I now open the mic, and I'll give the mic to you to your free participation on this.
That's a really interesting thing to have raised. I just wanted to say that I think that intensity that you mentioned about Robert Applebaum's quote there is something that came through in the way that Liz, Giulia, and Mark were all talking about food, the kind of intensity of experience, and how pre-modern people, but also I think very much modern people as well, and postmodern people, experience food in so many different ways, and those different ways inherently touch the way that we think about ourselves as humans. So even for non-religious people, that intensity, I think, is something that connects you with something that is beyond just the mundane, beyond just the physical, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, totally. Please, Mark.
Yeah, it's such a rich discussion. It's difficult to know where to begin, but just something Liz was saying about what I'm really interested in, particularly as a kind of medical ethicist, and is what the underpinning view of human flourishing and human identity is in medical ethics. It's a big thing, and it seems to me that in that domain, the dominant paradigm of what it is to be a human being is that of the expressive individualist, the idea that what we are fundamentally as human beings are atomized individuals who negotiate relationships secondarily with others in order to constitute families, community, and society. It's a very contractual model, and therefore it just got me thinking just two things. Firstly, food as a prism through which to discern the prevailing view of the human within a society, or maybe food practices might actually contradict and countervail the dominating rhetoric of the individual. It may be that people are living divided lives because their food practices evince a yearning for the social and the transcendent, but the dominant rhetoric is that of business and contract. And that kind of links into something that Liz was saying. I mean, I know that you, like me, are a critic of neoliberalism. But you know, if we take seriously the view that all human beings have an inalienable dignity, whether you give that a theological underpinning or not, then surely that provides you with the paradigm within which to set your social policies. And if people are unique and precious, then the idea of, well, let's say, giving people, giving everybody a stipend which will guarantee their basic needs, nutritional and otherwise, would be perfectly consistent with that theological or philosophical anthropology. But, with our ideas of the undeserving poor, and people needing to earn their living, and that's still a very strong rhetoric. You're dealing with that theology of scarcity, not that theology of abundance, which I think needs to underpin any idea that human beings are inescapably precious. So I rest my case.
Thank you, Mark. Liz, I think that you have raised your hand.
It's okay. I think probably others have. It was partly, I'll just say very quickly, it was in reaction to what Mark was saying at the beginning, because I think these ideas about atomized humans negotiating relations is a very, if you like, Eurocentric view. And I'm not very experienced now, but certainly when I was in my 20s and 30s, I lived for months at a time, at any rate, if not years, in societies where I don't think people did think like that. Certainly, as far as I could tell, I wasn't fluent enough in local languages I always had to go via translation. But my sense just of observation of people's behaviours was that people very much, in some societies that I worked in mid and southern Africa, people saw themselves as part of others rather than as individualized. I'm not a philosopher, as may be apparent from my groping for words here, but I do think there's different ways of being human, as it were, at some level. But I also feel quite strongly, perhaps not so evident, that most people are naturally disposed to care for others, and that a sense of purpose is central to a fulfilling life. Those two elements seem to me quite important in being human in most societies. Anyway, I said I wasn't going to say anything, and then I did. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Liz. Beat, would you like to come in now?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm in the same position as Mark. I don't know, which one, which of the many threads I could run with here. So I think there's a testimony to how stimulating it is what you've said. But maybe I just start with Mark, because he started our little round, and I wanted to ask you, why is the church so obsessed with food and with food rules and with telling people what to eat? Where does that come from when you think about the positive messages of food and even drink in the Bible? If you think of the wedding of Cana, or if you think of the Last Supper, etc. So where does this fear of food come from? And in this context, you feel slightly at risk by having such a positive attitude to commensality and by inviting people in to consume food and drink on this sacred space. So just to throw that at you.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, in a sense that I think most Christians that I come across today aren't obsessed with food in quite the way that our forebears would have been. I think it's kind of nutritionally less legalistic. What I'm interested in is the way in which the disciplines of the church have been interestingly inverted, and conscious of what Liz's cautions. This is perhaps a Eurocentric view. I was, is that, you know, take Advent and the lead up to Christmas when we're going to have our feast food fair. You know, Advent, you know, used to be a penitential season. You know, it was a season of preparation and discipline leading up to Christmas. You know, correlate with Lent in the lead up to, you know, to Easter. But, you know, so you have that rhythm of feasting and fasting, you know, consonant with the rhythms of the seasons of the church year. But actually, you still have those rhythms, but they're different in that the period of feasting and fasting leading up to Christmas and New Year usually begins somewhere in late November. And then you have kind of dry January, or certainly a more abstinent January. It isn't as if physical self-discipline is a Christian or religious monopoly. It isn't. But the referents are different, and I find this, you know, fascinating. So Christians, you know, in the Christian tradition, you fast in order to make yourself more aware and conscious of your dependence on God, and your physical and mental well-being is kind of a function of that. But in this day and age, of course, mental and physical well-being is the referent. You know, so people are conscious of the need to temper their episodes of nutritional profligacy with the, you know, with the counteracting discipline. And I find that, you know, kind of secular pattern very interesting. You know, it isn't as if, you know, religious people can say we're the only people who have the willpower to subject our minds and our bodies to the discipline that is needed. You know, not a bit of it. It's just that the rationale for doing so has changed. And of course, as a Christian priest in the Anglican tradition, where the boundary line between cultural Christianity and biblical Christianity, to use that probably inappropriate binary, and secularity is very blurred. You know, it's interesting. You know, most of us in the church, you know, probably begin our celebrations in late November. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Before we open to the audience, Giulia, you have your hand raised.
Try to unmute myself. Is this working? Yes. Sorry, my Teams is very slow. Yeah, I mean, I think somebody in the audience did raise their hand before me, but if we're just keeping it with the panel, I just wanted to quickly say thank you to everybody. It was really fascinating and exciting, and I just wanted to put a question out there, I guess, for the panel, which kind of picks up from different things all of you have talked about, but I guess I'll start with sort of Chris and the idea at the end of, you know, when you were talking about how the study of food allows to transcend time in a way and allows you to bridge together your research and you know, the way it can be talked about in different ways. And I was sort of struck as well when you were talking about you know, the meal, the house meals issues and the government, and the way in which there's also different dynamics that we can still see quite fascinatingly. If we think about the fact that war was waged, you know, over lands that could therefore then, you know, have crops and feed people, how, you know, the crux of Brexit negotiations sort of were based on fisheries and fish and the space, you know, that is shared there, and the way it continues to be such a crucial issue in socio sort of economic or socio-ecological relations. And I kind of wanted to just put a question out there that engages with some things Mark and Liz have also said, but a bit more with the ideas that, you know, Liz was talking about being a food citizen and knowing where the food comes from, and sort of taking this thread I started with, I wanted to bring to the different ideas of also how food can be a resistance in many ways. You know, there's this idea that food is nourishing for at different levels for not only physical but mental well-being, and it is crucial to identity. And I was wondering how issues of food resistance can also play an interesting role, if you had any thoughts on that. And the way you define resistance can be very much to your own understanding as well. I think there's different layers here, but yeah, that was sort of what I will put out there.
Yes, please, Chris, you would like to answer.
I thought that was really fascinating. Yeah, the idea of food resistance, I think, is something that is really fascinating. Not just in the sense of, actually refusing food as a method of resistance, which is something that we still see. One of the most ancient forms of political protest, that we have evidence for in all sorts of societies all around the world is, to go on hunger strike as a way of, effectively shaming, political opponents, is obviously something that is still used today in different contexts as a method of food resistance. And I suppose a lot of that idea of, using food as a method of resisting the other does come through in that Brexit stuff that you were talking about. And I guess it's almost ridiculous to have to talk about it, but it is also the front page of, a lot of newspapers. And as somebody who works on the history of sausages, the latest Brexit war is the war over sausages now. The British sausage is being victimized by the Brussels bogeyman. Before that, we had the chlorinated chicken. Before that, as Giulia mentioned, we had the fish. And, I do think it is very revealing how many of these repeated controversies, all of which focus on the minutiae of trade negotiations and rules that people would have absolutely no interest in normally, and are much less interesting than dozens of things that I imagine that we could all immediately come up with, of like, well, you go into the supermarket and buy X, Y, and Z that was produced by forced labor, or is destroying rainforest, or destroying an indigenous culture halfway around the world or something. But no, it's the sausage, it's the chicken, it's the British pork pie, I imagine, is going to, well, that was already one with regards to, European designations and stuff. And that goes back to that idea that, the reason why it becomes a focus of resistance is because it's so emotive. It's an easy thing for people to latch on to because it is emotive to people and they automatically identify with it. And I think that's really fascinating that persists, across different societies. It's not always possible, right? Like, it's obviously lots of people in Britain are not really worried about Brussels coming and taking the sausages and weren't worried about the bananas or whatever it was before. But a lot of people obviously are, and it obviously does communicate with a lot of people effectively as a political tool. And so that has to be taken seriously in the sense that, these are not just silly stories. They may be silly stories in the sense of, they are used for propaganda purposes, but they also reflect what people actually consider to be important and what people can identify with. That idea of, if we talk about food citizenship, there's something interesting that the citizen identifies with those stories in a way that if it was a story about tariffs more broadly, their political engagement, might be a lot lower, whether that's because of the way the media can sensationalize things or not. But I mean, that all ties into ideas of citizenship and society and community, is how we decide things are important. And the campaigning of Marcus Rashford, last year in the UK, that again seemed to really touch chords because of the way that these are intensely emotive issues. Like, as Ricardo said at the beginning of the discussion, that intensity of feeling that people have around food, we can't get away from it in some ways. And obviously it can be used and abused, but that's so fascinating to me that it still has that power.
Yeah, before we go with the, thank you, Chris. Before we go with the audience, I'd like to bring another question, just trying to focus on writing, because I think we've discussed a lot about religion so far, but I think that there is a lot in writing as well, in the way that you know, you've mentioned also, Giulia and Chris, about the importance of naming. So naming as the way in which things come into existence, and even the role of the translator, it could be understood also as the role of the person who cooks. So someone who is doing an interpretation from a wealth of culture and bring it forth for someone's consumption. And that also brings to this idea of this anthropological notion of eating and consuming in general, not, well, eating in particular, not just as a way of consuming something that will be metabolized, but also in a really broad way. We also eat with food, with words and with smell, as we also discussed in the reading session earlier. So even the landscape is involved. I mean, eating involves the air, the words that go with that. In a performatic way, eating is much more than just satiating ourselves. So I think that that's more on the realm of on the importance of poetry and of writing. Also, this idea that Liz mentioned, and Mark as well, of fruition, food as well as writing are part of enjoying. So they both are also interlinked in the very same moment of the intake of food. So yeah, I would like to just touch on that and open to the panel.
I think that idea of the translator and the cook, I think, is really interesting. Like, by writing something down, you are codifying it in a way that, you know, someone can teach me to make. Oh, do you want to go ahead, Kamala?
Yeah, sorry, please, Kamala.
What? Oh, thank you. No, my boss just called me for something. Let's see. I'm not a religious scholar, but I did go to Loyola University for my graduate school, and it is a Jesuit school. Never heard of Jesuits before until I went there, but one of the things I've learned is that Jesuits believe in good wine and good food, relaxing, and some kind of work-life balance. We've heard someone talk about how fasting is a way to be closer to God, to get God to take you seriously as a worshiper. But here, it's something that's part of something that you should do, that's good for you, that is something, you know, God loves you and he wants you to be happy. Are there any other practices that allow this type of thinking? Because a bit of wine and a nice time and a bit of relaxing can get you in balance where you can appreciate what God gives you and, you know, not be so wound up. That's basically the question I have. Are there other practices that go against the whole starve yourself, supplant yourself, and, you know, suffer in order for him to like you?
Thank you, Kamala. I don't know who'd like to answer that. Mark, yeah.
Some of my very best friends are Jesuits, so it might be a kind of inspiration for holding the beer festivals in the first place. I mean, it is. I mean, this is a very complicated historical story, you know, stretching back to the very earliest centuries of Christianity, and of course, there is a very long tradition of Christian mystical theology. Some of the the early desert fathers and mothers were were a group of people who lived different kinds of disciplined Christian lives. Some were hermits, some lived in community. They lived, I think, nutritionally deprived lives. You have certain well-known exemplars like Simon Stylites, who lived on a rock pillar in the Syrian desert in an attitude of extreme physical deprivation for a long time. I think the question that we need to always ask is what the fundamental motivation is for exercising the kind of discipline that you do. Is it because it is a manifestation of a basic hatred of materiality, which is a philosophy that we associate with that heterogeneous group of people that we refer to as the Gnostics? I think, and certainly some of the early Christian communities did tend in that direction. In fact, the boundary line, early Christianity was an incredibly inchoate and variegated movement, which kind of spread out in different directions. But what we would call classical Christian theology has always affirmed the goodness of creation, and by extension, the goodness of the human body. The body is not, as Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, put it, is not a prison to be escaped from, but a work of art to be brought to maturity. And therefore, if you're working with that kind of anthropology, then yes, there may be a place for physical discipline, which would include nutritional discipline, but it would, but it would be regulated by the ecclesiastical rhythm of feasts and fasts. Remember that religious people are not exercising brute willpower in order to prove to themselves that they've got mastery of their bodies. I mean, that's not what it's about. It's about living according to the rhythms of the gospel, which are encoded in the liturgical rhythms. And the ecclesiastical calendar is not ever simply about self-deprivation. It's also about abundance and a certain degree of profligacy. So that's kind of my roundabout kind of answer to your question, Kamala. That actually, I think the Jesuits, to my mind, are a kind of manifestation of good theology.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark. So, Chris, would you like to go on with what you were saying before?
Just to pick up on the very interesting discussion that Kamala and Mark were having there, I thought that, it's interesting how in different faiths around the world that divide but also link between discipline and celebration, or I suppose Epicureanism, the idea of like celebrating life through enjoying yourself and so on, also exists. I mean, the idea that the Buddha, sustained himself on a single grain of rice, for a long period of time shows the great discipline of Buddhism. But at the same time, the Buddha then, in later life becomes a kind of, extremely, garrulous figure who is able to enjoy himself as well and like celebrates enjoyment. And that is, I think, so many different parts of the world, we see different
relationships between discipline and celebration through food, but almost always both of those things. And I suppose that's why a lot of my work and a lot of other people's work, was inspired by early anthropology, because anthropologists were finding that no matter where you went in the world, you did find these dynamics. They were always different. There were always contextual ways in which they were different. And obviously, they were massively influenced by the fact that anthropology is a very, a discipline that has huge roots in colonialism. But at the same time, there is something amazingly interesting about the fact that we see those dynamics in so many different places where people display both a discipline and a celebration. And I suppose the reason for that in some ways is environmental and links to what Mark said about rhythms. We are talking about people for whom in pre-modern societies, the seasons of production and agriculture and so on were inescapable. And therefore the fact that people have seasons in which they have abundance and celebrate, and seasons in which they have to be more abstemious, is a way, maybe, Liz was talking earlier about growing a more resilient food system that both protects the environment, but also allows, all of us to eat with dignity. There is something very deep rooted in human society there. That the reason why we developed a lot of these rhythms in the first place is because of those natural rhythms. These were ways for us to make sense of those things socially and religiously.
Yeah, Liz?
Thank you. I really take what you've just been saying, and also Mark and Camilla. And I suppose what I was going to add I haven't quite thought it through. I can't quite see how it fits into the established religious approach. But the other obvious area that we haven't mentioned about where people deny themselves food, rather than being denied food because they don't have enough money or don't have access, is in the growth in what are now referred to collectively as eating disorders. This isn't an area where I've done very much research. I taught about it when I was at Warwick and in London School. In fact, when I was still at London School, which was before the present century, hardly anybody was researching things like anorexia and bulimia at all, but if they were, it was very much as a medical issue and how to treat. At that stage, there didn't seem to be a huge amount of sociological study. I think that maybe I just didn't know it, and that's certainly changed now. And there's a very large literature, particularly in feminist studies, about the ways in which women and now increasingly men in industrialized, post-capitalist, if you like, societies use food as a way of saying something about their position in the world. It is partly about disciplining their body, but it's also about making statements about that which they either don't like or reject within their society, and or of asserting control in circumstances where they may, for whatever reasons, feel they don't have enough control. And I'm aware that in even putting it like that, I'm probably being crude and I hope not offensive to people who are listening, because I'm aware that so-called eating disorders, I don't think we've got very good language. Coming back to this issue of language, I don't think we've got very good language to deal with that which is a kind of a self-abnegation or a control and or use of food as a control of one's own body in order to control external circumstances, often to huge personal detriment. And even to death, as I'm sure people are aware. That, if you just read general articles, they'll say this is on the rise now, and hard to, all sorts of theories as to why that is. But then you might think, well, maybe it's always been around, it's just that people weren't so aware of it, or there wasn't a language for discussing it. I don't know. As I say, it's not an area I know a lot about, other than occasionally having friends who are struggling with it. And also, of course, a lot of the language that's used to deal with eating disorders is language of addiction and of abuse. So I think it's quite a big, complex area, but there's no doubt that is a very major area where food is used for control and as a weapon.
Interesting, yeah. So, Giulia, please.
Am I unmuted? Not yet.
No, yeah.
Yes. Now we can. Sorry, my laptop is very slow. No, I thought this is really fascinating, what Lise is bringing in. And I think I wanted to try and also make a link with what Ricardo, you were talking about before. I've come across a lot of issues in relation to eating disorders, also in literary studies and the way memoirs are used by whether fictional or non-authors to engage with different eating disorders and talking about them in different ways. So I think then there's a link that comes back with the idea of writing as well. But with what Liz was talking about, the idea of control, and I also wanted to sort of put it in the conversation, how eating disorders sort of play a role when it comes as well to the idea of gender identity or the control over one's body when it's sort of, and you can't control it anymore. And the fact that it does touch young adult, I think, with a time where their body are developing in a way that, might sort of escape your control is quite crucial. And there's a lot that sort of could be quite interesting there. And I was sort of taking that approach to move back to this idea of writing and how you deal with it as well. How do you write the body in memoirs such as these? And I think today with eating disorders was also advanced a lot with the opening to the idea that body dysmorphia itself, the inability to see the body in certain ways, is part of these kind of disorders too. It's not just about how you eat and practically, but also how you engage with your body in different ways, and sort of how you write the body, I think, comes in with all the discussions we've had today, with the way we engage with food as a crucial role in, how we understand corporeality in many ways. And so as, Chris was engaging with your idea of writing, with this idea of the cook and the translator, it made me think of a lot of crucial roles of things such as cookbooks or sort of alternative writing, I guess, or different writings that engage with how you write food, the whole tradition of, the passing on recipes or secret recipes or secret ingredient that are so part of so many different, I think, cultural ideas. And I think obviously a lot of this comes from thinking of a colleague of mine's work, Dr. Fiona Farnsworth, who's done a whole work on sort of food as a resistance in certain communities, and has also a whole chapter on cookbooks that is fascinating. But yeah, so I was just putting in also this idea of, different types of writing, not just necessarily literary, but also cookbooks in all the different ways, and the absence of writing some recipes and the idea that they need to be passed on as well. I'll try to lower my hand now if my laptop allows.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's been fascinating experience this, and we can do nothing but to really thank you, just to have the confidence with Beat and me to go through this and to really be able to be willing to join us. And we are hoping that this space will be open in the future, and you'll be welcome, of course, to come back, and hopefully we'll be able to go to Berkswell at some point to have that pint, Mark.
Yes, well, I mean, put it in your diary. I mean, Friday, the 10th of December.
Yep.
Tickets will eventually be available online, but also at the door. So if you can buy them online in advance, that will put my heart at rest. But at the door is fine, and I will be there to greet you. And we can have a exercise towards each other, a ministry of conviviality.
Right, on this note, really, many thanks to all the panelists, to all the participants, to Ricardo for chairing so ably. I would like to wish everybody a good weekend and hope that you continue to engage with the food GRP events. And it's been a very fascinating and productive occasion, so hopefully we can maybe revisit it at some point in the future. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thank you.